Television has a strange relationship with mistakes. Most of the time, the networks catch them, cut them out, and pretend they never happened. Editors review every frame. Producers sign off on every second. Standards and practices committees comb through every word, every gesture, every background detail before anything reaches the living rooms of American families. That was especially true in the late 1960s, when CBS ran one of the tightest censorship operations in the history of broadcast television. Nothing got through without approval. Nothing aired without a fight. And yet, on one particular evening in September 1967, something slipped past all of them. Something the cameras caught that nobody planned, nobody approved, and nobody could take back once it went out over the airwaves to millions of viewers across the country. It happened during a live performance on the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. And the strange thing is, most people watching that night had no idea what they had just seen. It took years before anyone talked about it openly. But once people started looking again, really looking, the moment became one of the most talked about accidents in television history. To understand why that night mattered so much, you have to understand what kind of show the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour actually was, and why CBS was so desperate to control every inch of it. The show premiered on February 5, 1967, and from the very first episode, it was clear that Tom and Dick Smothers were not going to behave like the network expected them to. CBS had brought them in for one reason and one reason only. The network was hemorrhaging viewers on Sunday nights to NBC's Bonanza, a Western drama that had captured the imagination of a quarter of all American television viewers. CBS had tried everything. They had thrown established hits at that time slot and watched them crumble. Harry Mason failed. The Gary Moore Show failed. Network executives were running out of options, and in their desperation, they turned to two young brothers from California who played folk music, told jokes, and had a chemistry that audiences seemed to genuinely love. CBS hoped they could attract a younger demographic. What CBS got was something far more complicated, far more confrontational, and ultimately far more important than anyone in those boardrooms had bargained for. Tom and Dick Smothers had grown up shaped by loss. Their father, Major Thomas B. Smothers, Jr., was an Army officer who had been captured during the Japanese invasion of the Philippines in World War II. He survived the brutal Bataan Death March, endured the horrors of a prisoner of war camp in Japan, and was transferred to Korea in April 1945, just weeks before the war ended. He never survived that journey. Of the 110 men transferred with him, only 36 made it out alive. Major Smothers was the last to die. Their mother Ruth raised Tom and Dick alone in California, working long hours to keep the family together. That background of grief, resilience, and awareness of what war actually costs real human beings was woven into everything the brothers did on stage and on screen. When they made jokes about Vietnam, they were not being reckless. They were being honest in a way that very few people on national television were willing to be. Their comedy career had begun almost by accident. In 1959, they were booked for 2 weeks at the Purple Onion, a small club in San Francisco. The audiences loved them so much that the 2-week booking stretched into 36 weeks. They made $2,000 a week by the end of their run, a staggering amount compared to the $2 a night they had been earning just months before. Their style had developed organically out of their early college days, when Tom had started a group called the Casual Quintet. Dick taught himself bass just to join his brother. When the other members drifted away, Tom and Dick kept performing, and they started filling the gaps between songs with jokes and sibling arguments. The teasing felt real because it was real. Tom played the innocent, slightly dim-witted younger brother. Dick played the rational, put-upon older one. Tom would say things like, "Mom always liked you best," and audiences howled because there was something achingly familiar and true in those 4 words. By the time CBS handed them their own primetime variety show, the brothers had a specific vision for what they wanted to do with it. Tom had negotiated something almost unheard of in television at the time: genuine creative control. CBS agreed because they were desperate. They needed those ratings, and they were willing to make concessions to get them. That agreement, made in haste by executives who probably assumed they could claw it back later, turned out to be the foundation of one of the most politically charged programs in American broadcast history. Within 2 weeks of its premiere, The Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour had beaten Bonanza in the ratings. The network had their hit, but they had also unleashed something they had no idea how to contain. The show became a launching pad for voices that mainstream television had been carefully excluding for years. Pete Seeger, who had been effectively blacklisted from television for nearly 17 years because of his left-wing political views, was invited to perform. When he sang Waist Deep in the Big Muddy, a song that was unmistakably a criticism of President Lyndon B. Johnson's continued escalation of the Vietnam War, CBS cut it before it could air. Tom Smothers did not accept that quietly. He went to the press. He made noise. The public responded with enough anger that CBS was forced to let Seeger come back and perform the song uncensored on February 25, 1968, in front of millions of people. It was the first time a blacklisted artist had so directly and publicly challenged a sitting president on national television. And it happened because two brothers from California refused to be told what their show could and could not say. The writing staff the brothers assembled was equally remarkable. Young, hungry, and fearless, the room included people who would go on to reshape American comedy entirely. Steve Martin was among the first writers. Rob Reiner worked there. Lorne Michaels, who would later create Saturday Night Live, learned some of his most important lessons about what comedy could do in that writer's room. David Steinberg, whose own comedy routines about religion nearly gave CBS executives a collective nervous breakdown, was a regular presence. These writers were not just trying to get laughs. They were trying to say something. They understood that the audience watching was living through one of the most turbulent periods in American history, and they believed that comedy had an obligation to reflect that reality rather than paper over it with safe, sanitized entertainment. The bands the show brought in reflected that same commitment to the edge of things. Jefferson Airplane performed Crown of Creation, a song that wrestled openly with the terror of nuclear annihilation. Buffalo Springfield played For What It's Worth, a song that had become an anthem for a generation watching their country tear itself apart. Steppenwolf brought a raw, almost threatening energy into American living rooms with Born to Be Wild. The Doors performed with a full orchestra. These were not the kinds of acts that Ed Sullivan was booking on Sunday nights, and that contrast was very much the point. The Smothers Brothers were not just programming a television show. They were making a statement about who got to speak and who had been kept silent, and they were making that statement every single week in front of one of the largest audiences in America. And then came The Who. On September 17, 1967, the English rock band took the stage on the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour to perform My Generation. Anyone who knew anything about The Who knew that their live performances were not ordinary events. They had built a reputation on chaos and destruction, on the idea that rock and roll should be physical and dangerous and leave something behind that could not be undone. Keith Moon in particular operated on a different frequency from ordinary human beings. He did not approach a drum kit the way other drummers did. He attacked it, punished it, turned it into an instrument of spectacle as much as music. On this particular night, however, Moon had decided to take things considerably further than even his bandmates knew was coming. Without telling anyone, not his fellow musicians, not the show's producers, not the network, Moon had packed his bass drum with explosives. Not a small, carefully calculated amount. A genuinely dangerous amount, far beyond anything that had been discussed or agreed upon. The plan was simple in the way that catastrophically reckless plans always seem simple in the mind of the person conceiving them. The song would build to its climax, and then the drum kit would explode, and the audience would have something they would never forget for the rest of their lives. What Moon had not fully accounted for was the physics of the situation. When the explosives went off at the end of the performance, the blast was not just loud. It was physically violent. A piece of cymbal flew through the air and struck Moon himself, knocking him backward off his drum stool. Pete Townshend, standing nearby with his guitar, had his hair blown dramatically upward by the force of the explosion. More significantly, the concussive blast caused immediate damage to Townshend's hearing that would prove to be permanent and devastating. The ringing that started in his ears that night never fully stopped. Over the years, Townshend would speak candidly about losing nearly 90% of his hearing in one ear and about how that damage made playing guitar increasingly painful and difficult as time went on. The crowd was shocked into a moment of stunned silence before erupting. The CBS censors, who had been watching everything so carefully, were in a state of chaos. The directors had not known what was coming. Nobody had known what was coming except Moon, and even Moon probably had not anticipated the sheer scale of what he had set off. In the confusion and smoke that filled the stage, Pete Townshend reached out and grabbed Tom Smothers' acoustic guitar and smashed it against the stage. Tom Smothers stood there instead, too shocked and perhaps too amused to do anything but watch. It was the perfect conclusion to the mayhem, a gesture that completed the circle, a final act of deliberate destruction that said everything who wanted to say about what rock and roll meant and where it was going and what it refused to be. But here's the part that nobody noticed in the immediate aftermath of all that smoke and noise and shattered guitar. Here's the moment that the cameras caught by accident, the thing that the editors missed, the detail that slipped through the most rigorous censorship apparatus in American television. In the background, visible for just a few seconds while the chaos on stage was absorbing everyone's attention, something appeared that was never supposed to be there. The cameras had been swinging around trying to capture the explosion from the best angle, and in doing so, one of them briefly panned to a section of the backstage area and the surrounding environment that was not supposed to be in frame at all. What was captured there, in that few-second window, was evidence of something that the network and the show's producers had been at great pains to keep invisible. It was a glimpse behind the curtain not just of this performance but of the entire charade that CBS had been maintaining. The confirmation, right there on film, of what everyone in certain circles already suspected but had never been able to prove with something as unambiguous as a visual record on national television. The censors who reviewed the tape afterward were focused, understandably, on the explosion. They were looking for content violations in the performance itself, in what the band had done and said and destroyed. They were not looking at the background. Nobody was looking at the background. And so the tape went out, and the moment went with it. And for years it existed in that category of things that people feel certain they saw but cannot quite prove because they cannot make anyone else stop and look at the same corner of the frame at the same instant. The broader story of what happened to the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour in the years after that September night is a story about the limits of what American institutions will tolerate when something genuinely threatens their control of the conversation. CBS escalated its censorship steadily and relentlessly. Scripts had to be submitted for review 10 days before each show aired. Every word was examined. Every joke was interrogated. Guest performers with anything approaching a controversial history were cut or banned entirely. The brothers responded by developing a kind of guerrilla approach to their own show, submitting safe versions of tapes for review and then making last-minute changes before broadcast, playing a high-stakes game with a network that wore on everyone involved. Major sponsors began pulling their advertising. Companies like Ford and Procter & Gamble decided that the risks of being associated with a show that made jokes about Vietnam and mocked the president outweighed the benefits of the audience it delivered. CBS was losing millions. President Johnson had reportedly stayed up until 3 a.m. to call CBS executives and demand they get the Smothers Brothers under control. When Nixon came to office, the pressure intensified further. The network was caught between a genuinely popular show and an extraordinarily hostile political environment, and it chose the side of power, as institutions almost always do. In April 1969, CBS canceled the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. The official reason was that the brothers had failed to submit a tape on time, a claim that even CBS's own internal communications did not fully support. The real reason was politics. The real reason was that Tom and Dick Smothers had refused to stop saying true things on national television, and powerful people had run out of patience. The show was still in the top 10 most watched programs in America when it was canceled. Dick's impression of President Nixon, a brief joke in which he quipped about looking for the off button to end the Vietnam War, had been the final provocation. It was brilliant and it was accurate, and CBS killed the show for it. The brothers sued. They spent 4 years in court. And in April 1973, they won. The judge awarded them what amounted to more than $5.5 million in today's money. The ruling established that networks could not use administrative pretexts like missed deadlines as cover for what was really censorship-based cancellation. It was a landmark decision for creative freedom in broadcasting. But as Tom Smothers